Hi everyone, Gerald here again in the studio. I have something a little bit different for you today. So this painting is going to be a pure digital painting with no photo bashing, and it's actually inspired from watching a fellow Malaysian artist named Zeen Chin. Here is a brief look at his art station, and I'll definitely put a link up on this video description. So Zin is a proper illustrator, I should say, and while I was watching him paint, I really wanted to try out going back to basics in terms of doing a concept purely with brush and paint and no 3D, no blender, just back to basics. So this video took a total of 2 hours, but I'm definitely just gonna narrate through a 30-minute time-lapse version of this tutorial. So what I wanted to start with was just a simple line sketch. Here I am just with a default gray background, and I'm using a small, simple brush to basically just warm up my hands. And you can see me here sketching, and generally this is how I sketch. I like to let the lines move freely. I'm not trying to create clean lines because we're going to fix that and we're going to paint over that regardless. The goal is to just let the creativity flow, and in this case I'm not actually working on a client project, so it's a personal painting, so I'm just letting myself run free and wild in terms of shape languages that I like, aesthetics that I enjoy. So in this case, I'm just creating the usual form languages of a futuristic soldier and with a skull-like feature, a theme that I definitely love and I do a lot in my portfolio. And I am gradually leaning towards some kind of aquatic Navy SEAL kind of a vibe. Hence, there is that double tubes extending over into his face mask. So I kind of like to just sketch freely like this. Purely because no one's going to see this sketch, or it's not meant to be shown. It's purely just for me to understand how I want the form languages to read and how do I want the shapes to connect to one another, and also, to test out ideas that maybe I have in my head and I need to just see fleshed out. And if I don't like it, I can just quickly throw it away. So it becomes a less stressful, more freeing environment to design and just to come up with some fun ideas. So you see me kind of adding things and then just using a lasso tool and just cutting them away if I don't think they fit. Definitely what I'm looking for as well is a appealing silhouette, some kind of readable structure in the drawing. And also just clear indications of all the separate parts in the design. Which areas are going to be hard or soft, for example. It's something that I'm trying to establish in this early version. So now that I have a base design, I'm going to basically start off with a darker tone background. This is just to give me a nice base. So in terms of painting fundamentals, this is just to give yourself a neutral to dark background to work with. And then I'm going to start blocking out basically the character in shadow, right? And so I'm picking a kind of a warm gray for this, just because it's a nice palette that I like to work with. You can obviously go with cool grays as well, or whichever color you like. In this case, it's a warm-ish gray, because I think I was leaning towards green or some sort of olive color for the character. And so I'm just kind of blocking out the silhouette here with a darker value. The idea is, of course, is you want your character to be a darker value than your background. So the background color is actually going to affect the color of your shadows. So in this case, it's a warm gray background. So my shadows are basically going to be almost nearly unaffected by any sort of secondary or ambient color. But they'll definitely be on the warmer side of things. Now that I've established my base structure, I'm just working over it with a slightly lighter value. And then I'm gonna start to gradually tint this surface with color. So you can see my HSB slider, which is my hue, saturation, and brightness slider on the right-hand portion of the screen, or right-hand portion of the right to the canvas. That's where I tend to modify and adjust my colors that I'm working on. So what I wanted to do first is just block out the local colors on the character, on the concept. So an olive green for the armor parts and a light drab or khaki color for the cloth coverings on the pipings, and a gray tone for everything in between. I'm also working with a very neutral to low value group. So you notice the intensity of the values isn't that high, because I want to gradually build up the brightness or the intensity of the lighter tones. So I'm bouncing in between what I call more neutral values. I am gradually adding some light spots, some dark spots as I move along. But anytime I add a lighter color, I want to make sure that it's moving, it's complementing the rest of the palette. So I don't want the color to pop up too much, especially in these early stages of blocking the painting. I definitely don't want to over detail one section as well, because what I'm trying to do now is to establish all of the values throughout the painting and to make sure that the lighting is read clearly across the illustration. Because of that as well, I'm keeping the light very simple top down, and it's not a very aggressive light. It's actually quite a soft light, just because I'm not the best illustrator. I think I would even dare say I'm any good. Because I have less experience in this, I try to keep the lighting more simple. That way I can be sure I can kind of try to at least execute a decent job on this. So the more light I start to introduce, especially in the upper part, and here I am using the dodge tool to kind of adjust it, I can also start to inject a little bit more color, a little bit more vibrancy in the green, just to make sure that it becomes more visible of a hue. I'm also painting in some bounce lights at the moment. So the environment is dominantly warm gray, like I mentioned. So a lot of bounce color that I'll see in the lower half of the middle torso, as well as the cylindrical shoulder pads, are going to be a warmer gray, and that's going to make the character more integrated into its world and its background. So throughout this entire painting, I don't believe I've zoomed in once, and I found this really important because it allowed me to really look at the lighting as a whole. Where I should put warmer tones, where I should put slight color changes into the piece. As you can see here, I added some brown, orangey brown to the piping, and even more pronounced gray bounce light underneath all the lower portions of the armor. And that contrast of values does help to make the three-dimensional shape of this design pop. Whenever you're creating a character, especially something like this where it's a hard surface armor, you want to make sure you have a good understanding or a good grasp of painting primitive shapes in perspective with light and shadow, right? So the head part here is kind of like it's a strange shape, right? But if you really look at it, it's really just a irregular shaped cylinder. And the shoulders are actual cylinders, and then the chest is just a slightly irregular shaped cube. And if you can paint cylinders, cubes, and spheres, the top of the head is basically a sphere. If you can paint these shapes nicely, you should be able to start to grasp the idea of how to present your shapes properly with light and shadow in digital painting. So as I'm starting to go in deeper into the painting, I'm starting to flesh out certain mistakes maybe in the sketch. I fixed the perspective on the shoulder there, and I'm going to gradually start to build up the contrast in this piece using a lighter tone and gradually building it up. I'm only using one brush for this entire painting. It's a chalk brush, I think from the Jama Jurabaev brush pack. I'll definitely put up the link for that as well. It's one Jama Jurabaev's brush pack is one of my favorite brush packs. I've been using it for years now. And I don't really saw the need to swap out my brushes for this. So even when I was trying to add a little bit of texture onto the surface, I just wanted to try and keep it a more disciplined one brush approach to this, just to really reinforce my understanding of my fundamentals. So I'm going in, now that the large shapes are starting to become properly defined, I can start to flesh out the middle shapes, right? So what are large shapes? Well, those are the larger geometric forms that basically create the illusion of three-dimensional form language. And secondary shapes are the smaller objects attached to the surface. So areas like the eye socket, the console on the helmet, the little inserts in the chest armor, as well as the breathing tubes, as well as trying to flesh out the softer parts like wrinkles on the fabric and all the other in-between shapes. Breaking down your forms from large, medium to small is a great way of managing your painting. I wouldn't recommend going into the secondary or detail up until your 3D forms are really, really firm and clear in your design, in your illustration. And you can actually study a lot of more veteran painters. They actually skip a lot of the middle and detail parts and actually mainly focus on trying to get an extremely accurate large form. Because oftentimes actually that's how our eyes read shapes. We actually see the big shapes first. It's kind of like looking someone in the sunlight. You actually read the large shadows first and not so much the small details in someone's face, right? Like the freckles or eyelashes or whatnot. You actually read the large form. So I think a good successful painting, digital painting or traditional painting, should be more focused on the large forms and how they react under lighting. So now I'm adding a new layer to hand paint in the camouflage pattern. This is where I wanted to really emphasize on that aquatic amphibious soldier unit. So by painting some sort of caustic water caustics pattern or maritime camouflage on the armor. And I definitely wanted to use a separate layer for this because I wasn't really sure if I was going to like the result. But once I was happy with it, I merged the layer in. And now that I have the camouflage in, I can start working in all the secondary and detail elements, like in this case, the glowing eye, and also starting to flesh out all the smaller wrinkles, panel lines, part separation in the pieces here. The design is also dominantly quite dry looking now, and it's looking dry because there's all the reflectivity is quite consistent and it's very matte, and that's why the concept looks really dry. So eventually I'll start to inject more reflective surfaces, meaning they'll reflect more light and meaning they'll look brighter, to suggest different kinds of finishes on this design. So at this point, I would say the entire painting is reached way past the middle point, right? It's actually, in terms of form and shape, it's 80% done. Maybe 90% even, you could say that. So the following 15 minutes of narration is just me adding the balance 10-20% of the artwork. So you're not going to see much changes on the surface, but it took me the same amount of time to get it to this point. And that's a common occurrence whenever you're painting, right? The building up the structure is very quick and very fulfilling because it's fast. You get a lot of feedback. A lot of things happens in your canvas quite quickly. But that's the first stage. It's a very important stage, but it's the first stage. And then now I'm moving into details, and details take time. There's really no way to work around it, especially in this case when we're working like with a more traditional or more fundamental workflow. When I'm painting in every detail, I'm painting in every structure, I'm painting in every panel. So it definitely would take more time. As fun as this was, I think it was much more appealing as an exercise. If I was to use this approach for a studio production, which is normally what I do, if I was going to do this for work, I probably wouldn't use this approach just because it used up more time than necessary. I'm very happy with the final product, but I think it's probably just better as an exercise to just kind of remember my fundamentals. But I think definitely if I'm going back to work, I would go back to my usual workflow of some sort of 3D block out and photo bash and try to get more fidelity done quicker. So I'm going over the entire piece now, just kind of picking up, chipping away at the painting, trying to add more contrast points. So a contrast point is an area where the light is the brightest and the darks are the darkest. And because of that contrast, it creates visual interest. So you want to obviously target your contrast points near the focal areas, like the face of the design. So in this case, the forehead or the top of the head, the eyes and the breathing apparatus and the chin, as well as the top of the chest, are the focal areas. So I want to have the most light and the most dark values pooling there. And vice versa, you want to make sure the surrounding elements are kept soft and slightly muddled. That way they don't draw so much attention. And that contrast is actually what makes the two forms work together nicely in a painting. So the fabric section of the tubing, it's essentially, it just started off as a squarish cylinder. So imagine like a piece of tofu or something where it's just a stretched out piece of square cylinder, and then I should just added darker and lighter values pushed in between to simulate the way fabric works. Obviously, there's a whole bag of things to talk about when it comes to painting fabric. But essentially, the principles are the same, right? It's understanding primitive volumes like cylinders, squares, cuboids, rectangles, and then nudging the values around to create more irregular shapes. So now I'm beginning to add more panel lines on the face and enhancing the design, the clarity of the design of the helmet, and also starting to basically just find areas I can flesh out, darkening certain patterns of camouflage. I'm pretty much still working on one layer because it is a painting, and if this was a traditional painting, you would be just working on top of your illustration anyway. So that was definitely what I wanted to do. Like I said, if this was a job or a client work, I probably would separate these layers just to make sure I had some wiggle room for feedback or changes down the road. But it's quite nice. It reminds me of painting on Procreate on the iPad, where I'm really just limited to color picking and just the strokes of the paintbrush to basically create form. I'm also making sure that my brush opacity bounces back and forth. So in Photoshop, if you press the numpad numbers, which is the series of numbers on your keyboard, so 0 will change your opacity to 0 or 100%. If you press numpad 1, it will turn it to 10%. If you press it 1 twice, it will turn it to 11, and vice versa. So 2 is 20, 22, 3 is 30, and 33. So it's a nice quick way of changing the opacity of your brush, especially when you're working on a painting and you want to just be really quick about it. So that's a nice little tip if, say, you want to try and speed up your workflow whenever you do illustrations like this. So I was tempted to actually not use the lasso tool throughout the entire process. I was hoping to keep it very, very natural in terms of painting, but in the end I gave up. I just went back to my usual routes of just using lasso. Just found it much easier to get cleaner shapes by using, especially for a very mechanical design like this. And as I'm adding in the decals right now, it's the lasso is extremely important because I can quickly just cut into the forms and paint in all of these color accents. So I decided to add some yellow because I thought it'd be a nice color to complement the green color scheme of this design. And I'm really making sure that the values of yellow that I'm using are nice and it's not too dirty. So I want to make sure the saturation of the yellow, it's lighter when it's facing the light and a little bit more to the orange side as it's facing the shadow. I'm also beginning to select certain areas of the painting and desaturating them to turn them into just a clean metal gray color. And because my scene has no ambient color, it's just a warm gray, so my gray steel would just appear gray, right? As opposed to if this character was outdoor with a blue sky, very likely the metal colors would have a blue tint to it because the ambient colors would be blue. So at this point, I would be about an hour and a half in, and this would be like the last 30 minutes as I'm really just detailing up the surface or the area of importance, which is the face, right? And I'm trying to find ways to make the design look interesting. So for me, my background is design, so I'm never really not a good illustrator or artist. So what excites me is a fun design, it's a cool design. So I was kind of trying to find ways to make this character pop. The green color was nice. It was had a very nice military vibe to it. It looked really realistic, convincing, but I wanted to add a little bit of accent colors to still make this design pop. So this red accent on the face I thought was fun. It was a nice addition because it didn't distract from the military aspect, but it still added some nice visual, injecting some nice visual add-ons to the design. So here I'm just fleshing out the small panel lines, also adding some scuffs and paint rubbing on the yellow parts, to simulate wear and tear and bit of usage. And that's something that I personally really like to put in to my designs. I like things to look used and aged, and that they're not too well maintained. And just to me, it just adds a sense of realism, which I do enjoy. Basically similar to what you see in the Star Wars universe, right? So I'm still making sure that I'm constantly bouncing throughout the painting. I'm not getting too caught up in one section because I do want to make sure that every second or every minute of me in front of this canvas, I'm actually painting something. So I'm actually adding something to the painting. And this is something that's often overlooked because you could spend 10 hours on a painting, but your painting might not go anywhere because maybe you're just, for the first 5 hours, you are actually just fixing an eye or fixing a hand. And you might be in that scenario where you feel like, man, I've spent the whole afternoon working on this, but why isn't this painting going anywhere? And that's probably because you're spending more time getting stuck on a problem as opposed to adding anything new to the painting. And that's obviously one part of maybe you need more time to develop your skills, maybe you need more time to improve and practice. But there's also one part of sometimes you just have to learn to let go certain sections first, Try to just paint the areas that you're very confident first. And it's obviously easier said than done, but it's something that you have to work on. So that's why you see me painting, bouncing around throughout the entire design. Because honestly, after add dropping in a few strokes, I actually do feel like, I actually don't know what to add anymore to this part. And let me move on to another section really quickly so that I just refresh my mind again and just paint on something else. And that's basically how my mind is moving. It's like it's ping-ponging across the painting, right? left, right, top, bottom. I'm trying to make sure that I'm constantly injecting some kind of addition, so I don't get too caught up with either a disruptive area that maybe is just fighting me, or I just don't know how to make it work yet. And sometimes it's just a question of painting. Painting is really strange. Sometimes you need to paint another part first, and once you paint the other part, somehow you suddenly get the feeling or the knowledge to paint the previous part. So if something is kind of fighting you, like a little section, just stop on that bit and then jump to something else. And chances are, if you keep doing that, you start to find yourself building a little bit more confidence, because you're actually moving across the entire canvas, and it doesn't feel like you're fighting a dead end, right? So that's why I'm kind of constantly bouncing around. It's a big part is just trying to maintain my sanity, because like I said, I'm not a very proficient illustrator. I'm a concept artist by training, so I'm a 3D artist by education as well. So a lot of my knowledge is self-taught, and I want to make sure that it's still a very fun process for me creating this. So here, I just thought of adding a white decal, and I wasn't really sure whether I would like it, which is why I did it on a separate layer. And here I am trying to just add some scuffing, trying to play with the patterns. And I would drop this idea in the end just because I thought the white was kind of interfering with the entire palette, and I prefer just keeping that area clean. So after a little bit of messing around, I'll just delete this layer and just move on with what I have. So here I'm using a little bit like of a saturation brush, just trying to pop certain colors. I'm also adding a little yellow-orange accent on the shoulder armor here, and intentionally, again, just painting it by hand just to give a little bit of nice texture and a better, more painterly approach to things. And just being able to enhance all the other sections that I was kind of intentionally neglecting early on, as they were the outer elements, and so I didn't want to focus on them too soon. But now that the head area was pretty much complete, I can start to just go around the remainder of the painting and just begin to flesh out certain areas that I thought could use a tiny bit of polish. If I wanted to finish up this illustration fully, as you know, really polish it up to the point where it could be more presentable as a piece of poster or an illustration, I probably would need to spend several more hours just kind of gradually working my way in, maybe zooming in and actually fleshing out some of these details. But as a pseudo speed paint fundamentals training piece, I think this level of detail was sufficient. I'm quite happy with the way the lighting is. I wouldn't say it's anywhere as good as Zeen's lighting, but it was nice to play with. It was nice to go back to the basics again, and it was nice to explore a design that I think looks kind of cute, kind of fun, and he seems like a character that does have some personality in his costume. And so at this point, I would say I'm really just massaging the piece, right? Anything that I'm doing here, I highly doubt really has a impact on the entire piece, but it's more about presentation, about cleaning up loose ends, just making things slightly more readable. Essentially, I'm noodling at this point, right? Just kind of adding finishing touches. So at some point, I have to let this piece go. For me, usually it's the deadline is the one that tells me when I need to stop. But in this case, Zeen's tutorial painting was already wrapping up. I think it was his total presentation was about 2 hours, so that's the time that I had to play with this piece. And I was just kind of painting along as he talked, and while I was listening to his advice and listening to his methods of creating art. So last finishing touches of adding additional decals. Again, I love decals in pieces of art, because especially science fiction design, because they add color, they add a little bit of storytelling, they add pattern to the surface that might be seemingly plain, and just kind of gives it life. So here's the finished speed painting, or just finished product. It was a pretty fun experience. I haven't done this in a while, as you can see, but I think the outcome turned out pretty good. So I'm not sure how often I will do full paintovers like this. I probably would go back to my usual photo bash conceptual thing, but if you like this kind of content, if you like this kind of work, maybe I could squeeze in some more fun pieces like this down the road. Anyway, thanks so much for your time. That's me wrapping up. Have a good day, and I hope this was helpful.